Welcome back to part 2 of our lecture on the Battle of Passchendaele. We were reflecting on the problems and the conditions in that opening month of the offensive in late July and through August. There'd been rain before the infantry started, and rain continued through August, creating a lot of mud, massive shell craters filled with water. Things were bogged, people drowned, mules and horses drowned in mud, falling into a shell crater and drowning in the mud because of the thickness of the mud. However, Haig has his plans and he wants to continue. So while you can see here that from the 7th of June, that's where they make that progress, up until the 31st of July, they make a breakthrough up through to this point on the map. Let me get my laser happening. So now we've progressed to this point. But Haig's goal is the Battle of the village of Passchendaele here. So there's more ground to cover. You can also see the scale here. So that's 6 kilometres. So you can see already they've made not many kilometres. They've got about 12 kilometres to go if they want to make it to Passchendaele. So the battle must continue. Haig is convinced, absolutely convinced, that despite the conditions, despite the losses suffered by the Allies, the Germans are going to crack. He really honestly feels that German morale is about to sink, and which will allow him to achieve his breakthrough movement to get through to those ports of Ostend and Zeebrugge. So on the 25th of August, we see the next phase of the offensive begin. And here we're aiming to take the Menin Road, which is this road here, to move forward along the Menin Road and secure it through the town of Hooge. Also, this area here, Polygon Boss, it says here, which is Polygon Wood. So we need to move through this area of Polygon Wood and secure it, and then eventually to take this area, which is the Broodsind Ridge. Here's the village of Broodsind and the ridge area along here. So this is the next phase that Haig is pushing for. Really, it starts on the 25th of August, and it becomes a little bit easier for a while because the rain halts, things dry up, but unfortunately the type of soil in the area means that when it dries it turns to a very fine dust. You can see here on the Menin Road the dust that's being thrown up by the horses charging through this area. Called Hellfire Corner because the Germans on the ridge had a very good ability to see down onto the road. You can see some attempt to provide protection. It's just a screening. It's not going to stop any bullets, but just screening. But this area was known as Hellfire Corner because you had to basically ride or run like hell in order to get past without being caught by a German sniper. You can also see here, some of the destruction, a truck stuck on the side of the road. And many of these men are wounded, waiting for assistance, but they have made their way up the Menin Road. We've also got some signs here of men, and you can see as they're moving across, they're having to make new trenches, any foothold in the ground that they can get that provides some level of protection. And here they're near Polygon Woods, and they're making their way up towards the village of Passchendaele. Here's another scene here, and yes, we're having gas masks on because this is the part of the battle where we see the Germans introducing mustard gas for the first time. Here you can see a pillbox, which would have been a German concrete pillbox, and it's been secured by the Allies as they move their way across this battlefield. This is Polygon Wood, certainly what remained of it after the artillery bombardment and the attacks that are taking place across this battlefield. It's just good to pause and take a look at the destruction, because this is the landscape in which these soldiers are operating. We want to understand the experiences of these soldiers as they operate in this battle. This picture here gives us another example of a pillbox which has been secured by the Allies. But again, you're starting to see the shell craters and the conditions of the landscape that they are moving across. Rain came back in October, and that dry, fine dust turned to liquid mud. So the mud returned. And certainly, again, that Battle of Passchendaele is very much associated with mud. By this time, in October 1917, there's a very high level of sickness amongst the Allied troops, whether it's pneumonia, trench foot, trench fever, so very high rates of illness. And we also see some levels of desertion, something we haven't really seen to a great extent amongst the Allies before. But such are the conditions on this battlefield that's driving the men to take these kinds of decisions. But Haig wants them to push on. Here's the village of Passchendaele. They haven't achieved it yet, so he wants them to push on. So they've moved across this area, and you can see here, this is where they are by the 4th of October, and it's time to make the last push into Passchendaele. Allied casualties by this stage had reached 100,000, and the troops were absolutely exhausted. To give you a sense of the battlefield that they're travelling over in this very last phase of the battle. So this is looking from Broedsend, just up on the ridge, towards the village of Passchendaele over here. You can see the wide open land. So if the Germans have got gun emplacements just up on a slight ridge, they can see everything that's going to take place on this area. And this is where the Allied soldiers need to move across. To give you a sense of, that's a modern day picture. This is more like what the landscape would have looked like at the time. And you can see the desolation of this battlefield. To give you a sense of the extreme mud and the difficulties for manoeuvring through these areas, this is a famous Australian picture taken in Polygon Wood. You can see the duckboards that are down, and some of there are plenty of sources that tell us about the depth of the water inside these craters, inside these shell holes. As I said, people drowning in them, unable to be pulled out by their colleagues. Another famous photo of the Australians marching. You can see here again the reflection captured, reflects these mud-filled, water-filled mud holes, and the duckboards providing the safe passage across the battlefield. This is what the battlefield was looking like by November. You can see the depth of the mud. There was an attempt to use tanks in the Battle of Passchendaele, not very effective given the conditions in which these tanks are attempting to move in. Again, you can see explosions in the background there. But here we've got these exhausted soldiers just finding something to provide some level of protection. The most rudimentary trenches you could ever imagine. Yet more pictures again with the duckboards down, showing you, this was the safe passage across the battlefield. And this one, very poignant, lone soldier on this very, very muddy battlefield. We talked about mustard gas is used in the Battle of Passchendaele, used by the Germans for the first time, of course then adapted, used by Allies as well. So mustard gas is a development from the chlorine and the phosgene gas that we've seen used earlier in the war. And the problem with mustard gas is that it burns. It can burn the skin, the eyes, as well as inside if it's inhaled. The problem with mustard gas is that it doesn't necessarily exhibit its full injuries straight away. Sometimes it's hours later before the full effect of the burns start to impact on the soldier. Very, very nasty gas. The only benefit of the mustard gas is a very distinctive smell. So you can attempt to protect, but you can see the damage that it can do not only to the eyes and inhaling, but to the whole skin. So if used effectively, mustard gas, especially if taking the other side by surprise, was a very, very terrible gas, terrible effects. Finally, it's actually Canadian soldiers that finish the battle and do the final push, taking the village of Passchendaele on the 6th of November. And here's a Canadian soldier just caked in mud, and you can see them here. They're having to move forward across the battlefield, taking duck boards with them to secure the new positions. So while it's the 6th of November that we finally see the end of the Battle of Passchendaele, this was the first day that Haig's Chief of Staff actually visited the battlefield. Haig himself never actually went to the battlefield. And his Chief of Staff, on coming to the battlefield, made comments to the extent of, what have we done? Is this what they've been fighting in? And so again, reflecting on this imagery of the generals sending in the brave soldiers, really not having any understanding of what the battlefield was like, the conditions that those soldiers were facing, and pushing through with strategic plans that just could not be fulfilled given the conditions. The official casualty rates in the Third Battle of Ypres, the British, 245,000 casualties. The French, who went in as support, 8,000 casualties. And the Germans, 260,000 casualties. And it's suggested that, particularly in the final months, that maybe up to 1 in 4 of the British dead during that time, the casualties, the deaths came because of drowning in mud, not necessarily because of shell fire or machine gun fire. These are very heavy losses. And so the Battle of Passchendaele is yet again another battle of attrition. Very, very heavy losses. Just to give you a sense of what it leaves behind, this is a modern day picture of the Guildhall, the cloth Guildhall in Ypres, with the cathedral behind. Beautiful building. This is what it was like in November 1917. You can see the level of destruction. This is after 3 battles in this area. And this is an aerial shot to give you a sense of the extent of the devastation of this town. Clearly not occupied anymore, and the civilians had to come back at the end of the war and completely rebuild, which is what they did, including rebuilding their beautiful cathedral and Guildhall. One of the things to bear in mind with this war of attrition is that very heavy casualties on either side meant that the Allies in particular had been very much worn down by this battle. And as we move into 1918, and we'll talk about the reasons why the Germans begin their big counteroffensive, but when they do begin, the Allies are very worn, exhausted, numbers have dropped. And we've got to think about these battles that have taken place in 1916 and 1917 and the impact that they've had on the Allied army. And certainly we need to talk about the Third Battle of Ypres, or the Battle of Passchendaele. It's a symbol of the futility of attrition tactics. So late in the war, and yet we still have this battle of attrition taking place. That's it for our lecture on the Battle of Passchendaele. Next, we'll move on to take a look at some other aspects of the Western Front.